Get ready for one of the craziest months ever for paddle reviews on this channel. Let's start it off with the brand new Rhombus R1 and R3 Pulsar FX. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. May is going to be a wild ride. We're starting off with these new Rhombus paddles, but there are so many more coming to the store. Go check out our For You page if you want to see. Now, if you've been following the channel for the past few months, you'll know that I'm a pretty big fan of the Rhombus Nova series, so as you can imagine, I was super excited to get my hands on these. I've been testing them pretty extensively for the past several weeks, and there's some awesome playability to talk about here. Now, of course, before we go on, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So let's talk a little bit about the new tech going on inside these R1 and R3 Pulsar FX paddles. Up until now, Rhombus has had their traditionally molded .16 paddles, their Gen 2 thermoform Pulsar paddles, and then the Nova, which is one of the first paddles that I tested that had this unique ability to adapt to different types of shots. The Novas have Rhombus's still patent-pending edge grid technology, which flexes dynamically with how hard you hit. It's a technology that works wonders. On slower paced touch shots, the Novas feel pretty soft, but then they stiffen up the harder you hit for more power and spin. That technology is here on these Pulsar FXs, but there's another layer to it now. The whole grid idea worked so well on the edge of the paddle that they've gone and applied it to the whole face. They're calling it raw carbon grid, and by the way, Rhombus is continuing with their claim that this technology eliminates core crushing. We haven't had any issues with core crushing on the Novas, so I have no reason to doubt it. And my guess is that spreading this tech even farther around the paddle is just going to mean there's even less of a chance, so good work, Rhombus. But yeah, as you can see with this picture, you've got the grid pattern from the Nova on the edge, and the grid pattern on the face, and I'll say it right now, it has a massive effect on playability, but first let's talk about some specs. The R3 FX is 16.5 inches long with a traditional elongated paddle design. It's 16 millimeters thick, it weighs 8.2 ounces with a 122 swing weight, and has a 5.5 inch handle that's 4 1/8 inches thick. I do just quickly want to say, and this applies to the R1 FX and basically every other Rhombus paddle, but these have really good quality handles. There's no exposed honeycomb, they also feel firm, so there's not this weird noodly softness to the way the paddle swings through the air, which helps to give them a really solid feel. A good handle is slowly becoming industry standard, but Rhombus still leads the pack for that in my opinion, so kudos to them for that. Now the R1 FX is also 16.5 inches long, but it has that Hyperion-like arrow curve shape to it. Other than that, it's pretty much identical. It's also 16 millimeters thick, it weighs 8.2 ounces with a 5.5 inch long, 4 1/8 inch thick handle, but this one has a 119 swing weight. I've talked a lot about how these different shapes affect playability, so I won't get into it too much after this, but basically the R3 feels more powerful and stable, and the R1 feels more maneuverable and a little bit more spin friendly. The differences are marginal, much less obvious than paddles with different lengths, but they are noticeable if you're looking for them, and that's really how you should choose between these two. There's also the R2 that I haven't talked about and won't be reviewing today, but I will make a video about it in the future. Whether that's a video comparing it to the new Scorpius or a review on its own, I don't really know quite yet, but something will be coming. Enough yapping though, let's get into it. The best way I'm going to be able to explain how these paddles perform in terms of power, spin, and control is by first talking about feel, especially how that feel compares to the Nova, and also how it compares to Gen 2 thermoform paddles and non-thermoform paddles. The Nova's ability to stiffen up surprised me so much, because at first I was warming up with it in the kitchen and it felt more like a non-thermoform paddle, but then as soon as I hit my first drive, it felt almost as rigid as a Vatic. So basically, the Nova's dynamic core makes it feel thermoformed when you're hitting hard and non-thermoformed when you're hitting softly, but that's not the sensation I had with the FX. The FX's adaptability is much more subtle. There isn't a huge contrast in the feel between hard and soft shots. Instead, this paddle always feels a bit softer than Gen 2 thermoform paddles, but much more responsive than traditional paddles, and that responsive feel scales the harder you hit. Now that I've had a year to play with Gen 2 thermoform paddles, I realized that what I value most about their playability isn't the power or the spin, it's their responsiveness. If you play with a non-thermoform paddle right after playing with a thermoformed one, you'll realize just how mushy, undefined, and disconnected their feel is. That crisp response that we associate with a thermoform paddle's power, you miss it, because that's how you get such solid feel for the ball and a confidence that the paddle is going to put it where you tell it to. That's how the FX feels. On average softer than a Gen 2 thermoform paddle, but just as responsive. This feel makes sense because a grid style of layup is by definition less uniform, so less rigid, and it's also consistent with Rhombus's marketing claims that the FX paddles have longer dwell times. You probably see where this is going now, because when you combine a longer dwell time with a more responsive feel, yeah, you bet that has a pretty positive effect on control. I am hesitating to call these outright control paddles, but when you have this extended dwell time on paddles that feel this responsive, they really are top tier control paddles. The only reason I'm hesitating is because they're still not quite as soft as paddles like the original Ben Johns Hyperion, the Vanguard controls, or even the Luxe Control Airs. These do still have a firmness to them, less than stiff paddles, but they're not one of those turn your brain off, the softness will bail you out no matter what type of paddle. But personally, I don't really like paddles like that other than the Control Airs because they feel a bit mushy. The FX doesn't feel mushy at all, it has amazing feel, and it does cushion the ball a little bit more than other paddles with similarly good feel. In fact, let's go down the list. Gen 2 thermoform paddles, super stiff, no soft control. Kevlar paddles, still quite a bit firmer than this, albeit also with very good feel. The new Gen 3 Yolas, yes, they have a longer dwell time and the feel is phenomenal, but that dwell time has a trampoline effect that adds power to the ball, it doesn't cushion it. Now how about the Nova? I'm not going to lie, the Nova is currently my favorite paddle, so I have a bit of a soft spot for it, no pun intended, but I do think the FX has a slightly more consistent feel and therefore better control. The consistency issue with the Nova stems from its biggest asset, the adaptability. It's great because it gives you the best of both worlds, but sometimes that transition point between stiff and soft is hard to find. You don't have that with the FX. There is also a slightly, and I mean really slightly more muted feel on the Nova that I couldn't help but notice when I compared them side by side. So really, the only other paddle that I've tested that has this level of feel, responsiveness, and soft control is the Luxe Control Air. That's still a slightly better control paddle, but even just comparing it to that one is high enough praise. Touch shots were a breeze with the FX, and I especially liked resets and drops because they allowed me to benefit from that dwell time a little bit more than when dinking, which is obviously a more compact stroke. So you're hearing all these things about how good the soft control is, and you're probably thinking, okay, is the shoe going to drop with power? And the answer is no, the power is excellent here. I will still say power is the least impressive characteristic, and you can see with this shot, I had just switched from using the Gen 3 Yolas and I hit my first forehand so short I couldn't believe it. Remember, the technology here is still working with carbon. You can change the layup and the way it flexes, but at the end of the day, it's still the same material. Introducing a whole new material like foam on the Yolas and the Gearbox Pro Powers is why those paddles feel so unique, and yes, why they have insane amounts of power. Unlike those paddles, the dwell time here isn't springy. Again, it's not mushy the way traditionally molded paddles feel, but it's somewhere in between. Even though they are a little softer, that thermoformed responsiveness makes for a crisp pop as the ball exits the paddle face. That pop doesn't exponentially amplify power the way the trampoline effect does, but it does help it pretty significantly compared to traditionally soft paddles. Remember, these are still unibody thermoform paddles. There are gaps in the carbon, hence the more flexible feel, but there are no seams for the ball to lose energy during pocketing. Power is right up there with Gen 2 thermoform paddles, and I actually think a lot of players will prefer it since it is a little bit more controllable with that longer dwell time. I will say I prefer the power on ground strokes than I do on volleys. From the baseline, I feel like I can combine that dwell time with the crisp response to almost throw the ball as it exits the paddle face. Like that. At the net, at least for put-away volleys, I don't love that feeling of extended dwell time. I like a more instantaneous pop so that the ball just goes where I tell it to and that's it. Even compared to those trampoline effect paddles that do have an extended dwell time, that springy feel punches the ball a little bit more effectively, so I don't think the pop is quite as good here. That said, really good players will be able to transfer that throwing sensation up to the net, especially on roll volleys where you can benefit from that dwell time more than on putaways. I've saved the best for last. As much as I love the feel and the control these Pulsar FXs have to offer, I think it's the spin that impressed me the most. To explain how these paddles feel in the spin game, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about how Gen 2 thermoform paddles changed pickleball when they first came out. The reason those are so spin friendly is, again, because of the responsive feel they provide. There's no energy loss during dwell time, so they're this perfect conductor of spin from your technique into the ball. I didn't think spin could get much better until I started playing with Gen 3 paddles and realized that a softer feel, as long as it's still responsive, can actually amplify spin even farther, and that's what you get with these. As the ball sinks into the paddle face, you feel it grabbing onto the grit. It loads up on spin during dwell time, and then as it exits the paddle face, you can use that super responsive feel to shape it however you want. I'm going to talk about this term we use in tennis that I've started to realize is also extremely important in pickleball, called launch angle. Launch angle is the angle at which the ball leaves the paddle face, independent of the angle at which you're swinging the paddle. Higher launch angles push the ball a little deeper, but more importantly, they provide this sensation of extra purchase over the ball as long as the spin potential is high enough to match that launch. Understanding that difference in launch angle is key to understanding the difference in spin profiles between stiff Gen 2 thermoform paddles and longer dwell time paddles like this. Thermoform paddles launch lower, so they don't have that same potential to shape the ball. Softer paddles launch higher as long as they're gritty. Basically, these have a more grabby feel, and I'm not sure if that technically generates more RPMs, but it certainly gives you, the player, more control over the spin. I've said this before, but it's in spin variety that you benefit from this the most. You don't always have the opportunity to hit a perfectly set up ground stroke, and with these you can shape the ball from anywhere on the court. And by the way, what I said earlier about good players using that longer dwell time for roll volleys, that absolutely applies to this grabbier type of spin as well. You get way more spin up there with these. You can really dig into the ball and roll it into your opponent's court, whereas with Gen 2 thermoform paddles, if you try to grab the ball like that, the lower launch will almost make it feel like it's slipping and shooting down into the net. I want to quickly touch on sweet spot performance because it's obviously very important, and as you can probably expect, the sweet spot is very large. Because of the grid layup technology, the carbon is able to flex more even outside the sweet spot, so there isn't a weird rigid feel when you do make poor contact. On a thermoform paddle, the sweet spot feels forgiving because the paddle is still firm on off-center hits, so it doesn't just completely collapse and miss-hit the ball, but that rigidity does feel a little bit off. Honestly, I don't see who these paddles wouldn't work for, since I don't see them having any real significant weaknesses. When thermoform paddles first came out, it was obvious they weren't made for people who liked soft control. Even the Gen 3 Yolas and Gearbox Pro power paddles, I love that dwell time, but they're objectively not easy to control, and that learning curve means they're more made for advanced players. Basically, these feel like a more toned down version of a lot of different paddles, but the term toned down doesn't really do them justice. I'd rather use the word refined. The whole time I was playing with these, refined is what I was thinking about. Especially compared to the Gen 3 Yolas, which are awesome paddles and definitely going to make a huge splash. These are way less in your face about their playability, which may appeal to more players. Even compared to the Nova, which I still love by the way, it feels like spreading this grid design to the whole paddle was a logical move because now the technology is everywhere, so the paddle feels more consistent. It's also different to what other people are doing. I love the Gen 3 Yolas, but that bouncy foam feel is so wild that it's a really easy way of getting people to think, wow, this is awesome. This is less flashy, but I think it's a little more unique and just as effective once you fully understand it, and especially if those durability claims hold up. I think Rhombus is onto a massive winner with this tech. Of course, the R1 and R3 that I talked about today are elongated, so that makes them a little more exclusive, but that's where the R2 comes in, so I'll definitely talk about it another time. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you want to demo any of these paddles, you can come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.